All right. Kristan, you want to take it away?
All right. Hello. I am Kristan McNames. I'm the owner of Grace Funeral and Cremation Services here in Rockford. My contact information's down there. I will try not to bore you and to make this as interesting and fun as thinking about planning a funeral or cremation service can be. And I love questions, so I can incessantly talk about funeral service for hours on end, but I know we all have better things to do later today, I'm sure. I just wanted to give you a little background on the history of my funeral home. I opened in June of '09. We
Hey,
were a
Kristen,
tenant.
let's let 1 second here. Let's let people know. So, for those of you that have just joined us, we appreciate you coming, of course. There is a question and answer box down at the bottom of your screen. So, if any of you have questions as Kristen is going through her presentation here, please don't be afraid to put the questions in there. We will try and answer those as we go along. If not, there will be a time for Q&A at the end of the session here too. And we're also going to have this recorded, so we're going to post it on our website here. It gives us a little bit of time to get it up, but that way you guys can always come back and look at it. And as Kristen said, this isn't necessarily the most fun stuff to talk about and think about, but it is obviously very, very necessary. So that's why we wanted to invite her here, just because there's so much information out there about funeral planning, and we get the question all the time: should I pre-plan? Should I prepay? What do those options look like? That's kind of what Kristen is here for today, to kind of walk us through what your options will be, and things like that. So thanks again for everybody that joined us. So sorry, Kristen, go ahead.
That's all right. That was a way more professional introduction than mine. So thank you. You're an expert. So I opened my funeral home in June of '09. Initially, we rented space for 10 years from Heartland Community Church. It's now Forest City Church. I was in around 2,800 square feet of storefront space. So it worked for the season that we were there, but we outgrew it. I can only seat about 100 people there, and it was not comfortably in our actual physical location. And then I was able to use the church's chapel here and there for services. It was important to me through the whole process of my career to have a funeral home that doesn't look like a funeral home, because dealing with death and grief is difficult enough. And I just never liked the idea of going into a creepy building where you had to be quiet and it just kind of gloomy with, I don't know, the velvet curtains and the squishy carpet that kind of leads you to whisper the whole time. So, as funeral trends have been changing year over year, it's feedback that we get from families that they really do like the idea of having something that's bright and airy and kind of an extension of their own home. We moved into the former Moose Lodge, which is at 4301 North Main. It's across the street from Boylan, and our yard is adjacent to River Bluff Nursing Home in 2019. After about 11 months of wonderful construction, it was great. I do not recommend, but I've been here now since October of 2019. Some of the things that make us unique: I'm the only 100% female owned funeral home in the area. Um, we are locally owned, which I don't know if you follow the news, but there's been lots of transitions in local funeral service in the last few years, from independently owned multi-generational funeral homes selling to a Canadian corporations out of Houston, Texas. I used to work in that environment at Sunset Funeral Home and Memorial Gardens in Willwood, and that's kind of my background, was in corporate funeral service. And when I reflected on why I got into funeral service, it was not to talk to people that worked for me about JD Power's survey scores, and it was about the connections with families. And I've been heavily influenced by personal connection. My father died at the age of 43 when I was in high school. And that was really my first experience dealing with a funeral and helping plan it. And we had great service by the local director in the Chicago area, and he was kind of an inspiration at that point in my life. Some of the other things, we've got a pretty multifunctional building. If you remember the Moose Lodge from back in the day, it's a huge building. It's about 15,000 square feet. We can seat up to 300 people around tables for like informal events. And then we can seat up to like 620 people around in rows of chairs. So we are able to accommodate more people than any other of the providers in the area. And then having said that, there are a lot of services that are small and people outlive their friends. And there's ways with our facility to make it more warm and inviting and host smaller crowds of people as well. So it's not like you're walking in the room and it's giant and there's 3 people in the room. We get compliments constantly about the windows, letting light in, that it's airy, that it doesn't seem like a funeral home. We have a crematory on site, and that is important in the sense that once someone is brought into our care by our staff, they're not transferred to another provider in the area. They stay with us. So it's good in the sense that we have like chain of custody of the deceased person and identification procedures with families. And we really strive to make sure that families are comfortable with the care that we provide. As a sidebar, some people listen to this and they think it sounds really strange, but we have event space available. The front end of the funeral home really doesn't look like a funeral home at all. The room with the colorful chairs is our coffee lounge. And then the room at the bottom in the picture is our, I call it the gathering area. It's like where we do visitations and funeral services. So we can host different events, and that's really taken off in the last year or so. We've had people rented for family parties, quinceañeras, baby showers, things like that. And it's kind of once they get over that mental, I don't know, hang up of, oh, it's a funeral home. When they come in the front door, it doesn't seem like it is. We also have kind of a one-stop shop philosophy. When someone has died, we don't want the family to have to drive all over town unless that's something that they want to do. So we can handle writing obituaries, obviously filing all the legal paperwork, but we can take care of flowers for them. All of the printed materials that we have are done in-house. So if there's a need halfway through a visitation, maybe the family didn't order enough of the cards they needed, I can come in the office and print them. I try to just kind of control each step of the process to make it as smooth of a transition for people as possible. This is an example. This was a post-funeral lunch. They departed for the cemetery, and we flipped half of the room with tables and chairs so that they could have this set up. Halfway through the night, we cleared a bunch of the tables and chairs, and they had a dance floor, a DJ, Green Fire catered the event. There were signature drinks. This family has just been really great to work with. When this person's spouse died, we had an outdoor event where they rented 3 bouncy houses and had a tent set up with tables and chairs, again, like a full bar. Events can be fancy like this, or they can be more modest. And the thing that I really try to do is talk to people and kind of figure out what works best for the family, for their needs, for their budget. A lot of people can come into the funeral home and tell me everything they don't want because of previous experiences that they've had. But we do a lot of just interviewing and trying to figure out what best meets our customers' needs, much like your financial planners do. In addition to the human crematory, I have a pet brand called Faithful Friends. So we have an on-site pet crematory. I've heard from consumers that our prices are significantly lower than like cremating through the vet. We do offer transportation. However, most families will bring their pet to us for cremation. I can return cremated remains faster than most vets, which has been really comforting to a lot of people who feel like their pet. I have a Labrador that works here with me. They're not away from the family after they've died for long. We have rush options available, so we can sometimes get ashes same day if the family wants that, or the following day. It was important to me when I built this new place that we would have items that people could actually see and touch and look at. I do have catalogs to order things for pets and people, but I'm the kind of shopper where I want to know actually how big it is, an urn is, or a piece of jewelry by looking at it and seeing it. So we have a pretty extensive selection of different options for that as well. So to get into funeral options, a lot of people have historically done, like in my family, it was the visitation for 6 hours, the visitation the next day for an hour or two. Then we departed for church, and then we did the burial. And things are changing. So we honor those traditions that people have, whether they're religious or historically what a family has done. But there are really a lot of different options with funeral service now. So a traditional funeral would be, to me, the person is in a casket. It might be open, in which case we would go ahead with embalming. And a side note, embalming is never a state or federal law. A lot of people think that that is the case. In Illinois, it's not required by law that someone be embalmed. It's just temporary preservation of a deceased person, like for the purpose of doing a viewing. So traditional funeral, there's two examples here. The one in the top right was someone who was Hindu, and that was my first experience doing a service like that. And you can see that we kind of cleared the whole room because this was at the height of COVID. And they have traditions where they circle the casket 3 times and they bring incense to the family. And it's just really nice to be in a facility that we can spread out and honor everyone's religious traditions or wishes and customs. So a traditional funeral could be here at the funeral home. It could be at a church, or in some cases, they can be in other facilities, kind of depending on the owners of those facilities. There's Park District facilities here in Rockford that will allow, they won't allow a casket to be placed because I guess when you're walking through Nicholas Conservatory, you don't want to see that. So I've tried, not in a long time. So the majority of traditional funerals are typically here at the funeral home or a church. And then there are eco-friendly funerals. What those are, it's kind of an interchangeable term, eco-friendly, green funeral. Those are situations where at the bottom left here, there's the wicker basket casket. People are buried in natural fibers, so like linen, cotton. They have no metal on them. So they can either be placed into a casket like this, and they're made from different materials. There's like banana trees. They peel the bark off in banana sheaves, and they'll weave them into these caskets. And in this case, the casket goes directly into the ground without a burial vault. And burial vaults are typically in our area a cemetery requirement that the casket be placed into. So currently, there's no options for green burials here in the Rockford region, like proper. There is a nature preserve in Galena that offers full body burials that are eco-friendly, and also the burial of ashes. And then there's one in Milwaukee, and there's one up by Madison, Wisconsin as well. Local burials can be more eco-friendly. So what I mean by that is we have worked with area cemeteries when someone wants a green or eco-friendly service, and they'll allow us to, instead of putting the vault in the ground, they have it's basically just like a frame of concrete, and it doesn't have a bottom on it, and the casket goes into it, and then they put the dirt over the whole casket. So it still fulfills the cemetery's requirement of having a vault or outer burial container. And the reason for those types of things are it's kind of supports the load of the earth when their machinery is driving over it. If you've been to old cemeteries, you'll see that the graves are kind of waffly and caved in here and there. And that's typically where there weren't burial vaults involved. There are also caskets. So if someone doesn't want like a wicker basket casket, or their weight prevents them from being in something like this, we can use caskets that are from a manufacturer not very far from here in Wisconsin, that are just like plain pine boxes. They don't have metal in them, similar to what people of Jewish and Muslim faiths will purchase for those. Unfunerals is something that is becoming more popular, and a lot of times they're like just their memorial services where like the deceased body isn't present. But we've had home funerals that we facilitated. A family wanted to have their child at home in her bedroom, and she was not embalmed. We used alternative things. We used dry ice to make sure that, she was still presentable after, a day and an evening into the next day. There's more people that don't want something solemn. They want a celebration of life. They want someone standing up and toasting and eating wine and cheese, and have a more festive atmosphere. So we're able to respond to those needs with our facility because we can kind of change things up internally. And then a burial at sea is something that I have never personally done, but I've been asked about it, and it's available. People can either, like family can be present for the burial at sea. There's boat ships that take the deceased out, and there's an example of a coffin shape container down here. They can also be wrapped in like a natural fabric tarp. And then the deceased person has to be weighed down with something heavy, so they kind of sink to the bottom of the ocean. And the whole purpose is that they go back to nature or go back to the earth. The picture at the bottom, those are cannonballs that they're still making, and they were forged from the same company or forged that made cannonballs during the Civil War. So that's an option for people. And then there's also unattended burials at sea, where the funeral home's responsibility is to get the deceased person to either coast, and then another funeral home will pick up the person, and family isn't present, but they're kind of given like the GPS coordinates of where the person's been buried at sea, so they have that available. Donation to science is something that comes up pretty frequently. There are companies online, if you were to Google like cheap cremation, low cost cremation, that will pop up, and they're kind of one entity of the donation to science spectrum. The reason that those services are free is because they contract with funeral homes at the local level, and we're paid by those companies. We used to have a contract with one of them to do local services, and it's a very heavily unregulated industry, and it's fraught with just strange things, and the company is like not making choices that are ethical. You can Google it. It's gross, so I'm not really going to go into it today, but I highly encourage people, if they want to do donation to science, there's costs involved at the funeral home, because it's our responsibility to pick the person up, meet the family, file paperwork, get the deceased person to where they need to go and where their family wants them to go. And the reason that I love the university programs is they employ actual funeral directors. You have to typically pre-register, or your family has to agree to it at the time of death. And the university programs are like solid programs where nursing students will learn from the deceased person, physicians, dental hygienists. When I was in mortuary school, we had a cadaver that we used. They're very respectful. They return ashes if the family wants them returned, or if the deceased has like pre-registered for the cremated remains or ashes to go somewhere. They typically hold on to the deceased person for like 1 to 2 years after the donation, and then they will cremate and return cremated remains. And then they usually will do a memorial service each year for people who have chosen to do that. The low cost cremation places kind of parcel out deceased people, and they use them for ballistics testing, motor vehicle crash testing, things like that, which to each his own. Some people are fine with that, but it's a lot of like educating families and having them kind of understand what they're signing up for. There are nominal costs to the consumer when you go this route. And I love the UW Madison has a program, and Northern Illinois are the two closest programs to us that offer that. And they both do, in my opinion, a good job. What are some questions that you should ask if you've thought about going to a funeral home or picking up the phone and finding out what you should do for services or what costs are involved? I think it's important personally to support like locally owned businesses, not corporations that aren't here in town. I've been a member, it's disbanded now, but of Winnebago Buy Local for years and on the board, and more of your dollars stay in the community when you shop locally. You want to get the total price for the services that you're looking into. And this is something that I have tried to make it as easy as possible for people. We have our government issued, mandated general price list, and it has to be in a certain format. But the average person that looks at a general price list, it's like reading hieroglyphics. Like they don't know what factors kind of go into each component. So we have that, but then I also have packages that include everything. So a lot of times customers or people will just be price shopping on the phone, and they'll get a price from a provider that seems really low. But once they get in the door, there's all of these extra fees that are added onto it. So it's always important to find out, like, if I want just a cremation, what is included in that? And are there additional charges for this service? You want to know if there's a way to reduce costs. If you look at something and it's a quote and it's not what you want to spend or not in your budget, there's different options for breaking a service down and making it less expensive. I try to work within whatever the family's parameters are. I'm not a salesperson. I'm terrible, was always terrible at it. I love educating people and then letting them make their own decision. So it's just a good idea. If you like a casket that is blue and metal, they probably have something that might be less expensive or more expensive. I try to show people all of the options. Like if they tell me pink is mom's favorite color, then we pull out the pink caskets and they can decide what they want to do. You want to know if you're doing a pre-plan, if the prices are guaranteed. So there's been movement away in funeral service kind of post-COVID where we couldn't really control the costs of merchandise, like a casket coming in from overseas. So funeral homes have moved toward not guaranteeing the products and services cost. We still do. And what that means is if you were to prearrange a funeral today, any of the services, so that would be like the overhead of the funeral home, embalming, dressing, casketing, cosmetology, vehicles, all of those prices are guaranteed at the price when you meet with me. We also guarantee the merchandise prices. So if the casket is $2,000 now, your family or whomever is in charge of your arrangements doesn't have to pay the difference between price increases down the road. The way that funeral homes are able to guarantee those is any money, like we're kind of gambling. We're running the risk that inflation might be more than what the policy will eventually pay out to us. But typically, we cover the price increases by the money that the policy has earned. You want to know if there's a payment plan available, if that's something that you need. On pre-arrangements, there typically are payment plans available to consumers unless someone is terminally ill or like of a certain age, like once you're beyond a certain age, like you just have to pay for the full pre-need at the time that you meet. There are lots of people also, as an aside, that will pick things out with the funeral home and get their biographical information and sit and pick everything out that don't prepay. And I'll get to that later. You want to know if your funds are safe. So when you make a pre-arrangement in the state of Illinois, you should never write the check or have the funeral home swipe your credit card directly. It protects you as the consumer. We're regulated by the Illinois Comptroller, so they will come in periodically. And I've had one audit in the 17 years I've been open. I think they're supposed to come like once every couple of years, but it's the state and they're busy. So what they'll do is if I say that these are the people that have died that I originally had pre-planning policies for, they pick a random list of people and I have to pull the files and hand them over and show that, yes, Mrs. Smith did in fact die. Here's a copy of her death certificate. Here's all of the stuff the family planned. And that's so that the funeral home that you've prepaid with hasn't needed money to pay their mortgage and claimed that Mrs. Smith died and she's in fact still alive, and the funeral home has taken the money from the pre-arrangement funds and used it for their day-to-day expenses or their drug habit or whatever. So we're really regulated in that sense in Illinois, and it's good for the consumer. So when we meet with a family, we either have the option of putting the money that the family pays into a funeral trust or a life insurance product. And with the life insurance product, there's only 2 health questions on it. A lot of people think like, oh, I have all of these ailments, like I can't possibly pay. It's going to be exorbitantly expensive. And that's not the case. There's very limited underwriting. And as long as people are honest when they sit down with us and answer the health questions honestly, the policies will pay out at the time of death. So you want to make sure that the company, the funeral home you're dealing with, is putting the money where it needs to go. The way that the process works is I sit down, we chat about kind of what you want, what you don't want. You pick out the things that you want, and then I can show people what their payments are. Obviously, if you're funding something over a 10-year time frame, it's going to be significantly more expensive in the tail end than if you were to make payments for a year. So that's something that I've had to kind of effectively articulate to customers who haven't understood that over time. But then you will get a policy in the mail directly from the life insurance company that we use. And if you pre-plan somewhere and that hasn't arrived, then you need to make sure and check on that. We need to pause for 1 second, Kristin, and because my person is here.
Perfect.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Okay. Let me see.
So I know that somebody threw a question in here, and we're actually going to ask Kristin about this when she gets back. So thank you guys for putting your question in there. Please, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you guys weren't on right away, there is a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen that you can just click on and enter any questions that you have in there, and we'll have Kristin answer them hopefully as she goes through it. If not, there'll be another Q&A session at the end as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
Kristin did let us know there was somebody that was supposed to pop by earlier that had ran late. So apologize for that, but she's doing the best that she can, of course. So before she's back, I guess it is important. You guys are obviously all here for a reason. Obviously, you have interest in learning about this, and it's not fun. But again, kudos for making the time to do it. It is good to at least have a plan formulated. We always tell people it keeps the people making the decisions for you from feeling the pressure of making decisions that you would want at a time when when they're grieving too. So although this isn't fun, we always tell people maybe make a plan to think about this and then make a plan to go do something fun, go get ice cream. So anyway, back to you, Kristin.
My joke is always like when a couple comes in, I'll be like, "Oh, is this your date for the day? Like now you need to go do something fun. Go out to
Yeah,
dinner. Like
right.
who wants to think about this?" And while you've talked about that, like it really truly is a gift, like to your spouse, even if it's just a conversation, your spouse, your partner,
Hmm.
your children, even if you don't want to like pay it in advance, it's just a gift in the sense that like your children will know what you wanted. And I see that when a death has occurred and no discussions have been made because death is gloomy. And if we talk about it, grandma might die. It's just such a relief for people to come in and know, like, my mom wanted her funeral at Holy Family. And this is the cemetery that she's going to go to because we've owned plots here for years, or dad wanted cremation with a memorial service. And especially if you have any family situations where there's any like strife or animosity, I've seen people almost come to blows over like funeral decisions, what mom wanted one person thinks and the other. So it's just, even if you never called a funeral home or walked in the front door to do this, if you took the time to get out a notepad and hammered out what you wanted, and you also have to let someone know where it is. I get calls all the time from people who they have a death that occurred suddenly or even not suddenly, and they're calling, the person's calling every funeral home in town because, well, I know my mom pre-planned somewhere, but she never told us. And like, no one needs that stress when someone is sitting in the morgue at a hospital or in the emergency room or at the coroner's office. Like, it's just, it's a gift to your family. You want to know, like, when a death occurs, like, who will your family meet with at the time of death? A lot of places might have like a dynamic salesperson, but they have a churn of staff that's in and out the door because it's typically like a commissioned role in a lot of places. And they end up like not meeting that person, that nice lady Diane from 10 years ago. And it's like someone else that, you know, they don't connect with. Like we are busy here, and I never want to get to the point where like I can't individually like at least say hello and talk to families as kind of things go on. My advice is always to meet with like 2 or 3 providers just to compare pricing and make sure it's apples to apples. What I mean by that is if you are asking for a price for a traditional funeral with embalming, visitation, a casket, the funeral the next day, you want to make sure that all of those components are equal when you're comparing things. The reason for that is, although we have a regulated Federal Trade Commission regulated price list, we put emphasis on different things in individual funeral homes. So one funeral home might have incredibly inexpensive caskets, but their service charges might be incredibly high compared to the next provider that you talk to. So that's why I advise people to go to at least 2 or 3 places. And you can get information over the phone, but it is so hard to articulate everything that you need over the phone in a 5-minute phone call. And some people don't even give us like that much time on the phone. It's like I have to be and try to like help them understand like all of these things, because it's not just prices that are like controlled here at the funeral home. There's extraneous prices that are involved as well. So like the Rockford Register Star obituary right now is around, for a full obit one day with a photo, $750. Vault setting and delivery. There's payment for if you want a minister or singers and pianists. Like there's all these other components. And that's why I think it's important to try to give everyone the full picture. Mm-hmm. There are some people who will pick everything out and they'll only pay for a small portion of it. And we can work with like any budget. So if someone only has an extra $100 a month, like we can pre-plan just one segment of the funeral. Once that's paid off, we can move along to the next segment too.
So we had a question come Kristin,
Yes.
that kind of, so what happens if the funeral home goes out of business after you've purchased a prepayment policy with them?
This is my favorite question because I was an upstart startup funeral home here in Rockford that came out of nowhere. And that was like the question I got for probably the first decade of business. You're really nice, but back to the comptroller. So prepaid funeral funds, we use an insurance product. Those are held by the insurance company. So if a funeral home goes out of business, and as an example, there have been some locally, like I'm going to go way back. Burpee Wood was a funeral home that was kind of downtown area, and they just closed up shop. They didn't try to sell their business. They didn't try to sell their building. They were just done being funeral directors. So those funeral pre-needs were transferred to another local provider. When that happens, we're required by law to send a letter to every person who has prepaid a funeral, letting them know Burpee Wood Funeral Home is no longer in business. Your pre-arrangement has been transferred to XYZ Funeral Home. You can, and there's verbiage in the letter that says something along the lines of, you can keep your funeral here and it will be honored by XYZ Funeral Home. But let's say you open the letter and you don't like that place because you went there and the deceased person looked terrible and you don't want that for yourself or your loved one, you can transfer it to any other provider in the area. So on the transferability portion of it, if you prepay here in Rockford and you decide you want to move to your kid with where your kids are in Arizona, you're tired of winters here, you are the owner of the policy, so you can take it with you wherever you go. And we've done those kind of back and forth transfers where someone thought they were going to stay here in Rockford forever, but they, got sick and their daughter wanted them to move closer. It's a simple form that I sign as the funeral director, releasing the funds. It goes to the other provider and then they take care of it there. The caveat with that is that if you are moving from Rockford, Illinois to New York City, your funeral will probably be more expensive. So you'll always have that base money that you've paid into it to apply toward a funeral or a cremation service, but you may have to pay the difference between, or your family, between what it costs here and what it costs in the place you move to. If you prearrange a cremation, which just a direct cremation is least expensive type of service, and move to Florida, you might get money back because I don't know how they do it, but they have cremation services that are incredibly inexpensive. So one option for a cremation would be like a traditional funeral followed by cremation. So some families will elect to purchase a casket for that. And if they've purchased the casket, the deceased person stays in the casket for the whole process and is actually cremated inside that casket that they purchased. Something that's more cost effective are rental caskets. So a rental casket, the shell of the casket is reused from person to person, but the interior is always replaced. So there's the fabric in it, the liner, there's a box inside, and the end of the casket flips open and we can pull the box out with the deceased person in it, and then that's what's cremated. And those are used over and over. Some people will just do a visitation, some will do a funeral service, some will do both. So I'm looking at my notes. Once they're cremated, ashes can be buried in a local cemetery. And some cemeteries locally require an urn vault, which is just basically a miniature version of what a casket vault is. There are some other cemeteries that will allow anything that's like retrievable, an urn that if you decide in 20 years that you want to move your person to another cemetery or take them with you, it'll just be an urn that's directly in the ground. And so they don't require the additional urn vault, which saves money there. Visitation with memorial service is something where the body of the person isn't present. So we might have an urn, This is an example of like an urn arc in the middle picture with the flag, where we can put a photo of the person, the flag, flowers off to the sides. I like this option for church services because we can use pallbearers still. And that's important to some families. Like they want to try to include as many people in each step as possible. So the service can be, again, funeral home, church, or another location. And then kind of the most basic cremation service is called a direct cremation. And that is where we pick the person up from their place of death. We meet family, gather bio information, and then go ahead with cremation. And then we release the ashes directly to the family. With any of these options, if you chose the middle option where you wanted memorial visitation and memorial service, you can still view the deceased person prior to cremation. A lot of people don't understand that that's an option. So I've tried to educate people with that. You don't have to be embalmed for this at my funeral home. There are some funeral homes that, and it's not legal, in my opinion, because as a consumer, you can pick and choose what you want and don't want. So we don't require embalming if you want to just come in and do a family viewing prior to cremation. So that's a question to ask if this is something that you're leaning toward. The providers that you reach out to is like, will you require me to do embalming? And it should not be required, in my opinion, because it's perfectly acceptable in 99% of the cases to have a family come in and do a viewing of an unembalmed person. We also make the people look as best as we can without doing embalming if the family doesn't want it. I have worked for providers in the Chicago area where they don't like cremation, they're losing money, and they have their own personal kind of slant or thought process with it. And they will not prepare the person. So if someone is autopsied, they'll not suture the incisions in their head, in their chest. They won't put any makeup on them. And it's kind of, in my opinion, like they're trying to punish the family for picking this terrible route. And the best thing about dealing with a younger funeral director is that I did not grow up in the glory days of funeral service where a funeral director could just sit down and push a paper to you that wasn't itemized. I don't know what it's like to be a funeral director in 1982 before the Federal Trade Commission came in and started regulating us. So like, I just want to serve the families. And I think that every choice that people make is valid. A lot of families will elect to kind of to do a service on their own. Sometimes it's at a church, and nursing home chapels. Wesley Willows has a chapel. Fairhaven has a chapel. They have started charging the family a nominal fee because it's very difficult for their staff to do their day-to-day jobs and be funeral directors, in air quotes, because they're not really. So there's those options of doing it on your own. Some people will take an urn home and have a pool party and do it that way. Like every choice or decision that people make, in my opinion, is completely valid, and like people's wishes should be honored. There's a lot of changes in funeral service. Like, what can you do with ashes? They can go into a niche, which is like an individual on the left here. The black part of the niche comes off the front, and the urn gets placed in there, and then the marble goes back up, and they can have like a bronze nameplate on them. They can be engraved directly on the marble. An ossuary is something that there's only 2 cemeteries currently locally that offer this. So the thing at the top where it's the black slanted piece, that comes off. It's usually got like a master lock on it, and then it's unlocked. And underneath the ground is a vault that contains cremated remains of innumerable people. So they've buried a burial vault. There's a tube that goes down into it. They have a little ceremony here at this ossuary, open it up. The family can put the cremated remains or ashes in, and then it's closed up. And then there's different memorialization options for that. Like some places have a brick that you can get your name on. Others have bronze nameplate is what you can have on there. Scattering comes up all the time when I'm at the senior expo. And then even when I'm meeting families here, they think they're being like tricksy and don't tell her what we're going to do. I don't care what you do with your cremated remains. I'll give you advice. My former employer had a family shut down Mount Rushmore because they scattered ashes and they thought it was anthrax. So they came back and were like, it is not legal to scatter on inland bodies of water. So that would be like lakes, rivers, streams. It's not a health hazard though. And I've always been a forgiveness versus permission person. So people make their own choices in this, and there's nothing unhealthy about it or unhygienic. We have people that, they'll go to Wrigley Field and try to scatter like all of the cremated remains there. And like, it's not a good idea. A little goes a long way. People are constantly, they don't realize that you get about 9 to 10 pounds of cremated remains back. And that's whether someone is a little waif of a wispy person or morbidly obese. Like it's usually about the same amount of cremated remains. Sometimes it's less, but so people who get cremated remains or ashes back, like, oh, I'm going to scatter these. And my one cautionary tale is if you are trying to have someone interred in a cemetery, follow the rules of the cemetery. Because when I was the general manager of the cemetery, people didn't want to pay to have the ashes placed with someone that had been previously buried. And they would sneak out on Sunday and just like dump a pile of cremated remains on the graves. And at Sunset, where I was employed, those were footstones, but we think headstones, the average consumer. So they were actually not, in fact, dumping ashes on their grandmother's grave. They were dumping them on a stranger's grave. And then our staff would have to go out and vacuum them up and put them in a file cabinet and call the family, because typically 9 times out of 10, they had called 2 weeks prior and gotten pricing and didn't want to pay the price. So it also provides, when you do it the right way through a cemetery, like permanent memorialization, like a name on a grave. And if not that, just like a record. Like there are lots of people that are into genealogy. And that's kind of one of the thoughts I've had over time is like, we have all of these people in urns sitting on a shelf or under a bed or in a closet. Like what's going to happen to their history if we can't find it anywhere?
We did have a quick question. So just to confirm, somebody asked a question about spreading ashes in their own private backyard garden.
You can spread them on private property as long as you have the permission of the property owner or are the property owner. Thought process with that is like really consider if you sell your house and it's no longer in the family, like is that okay for long term to have that there? I've had questions about people wanting to bury people like on their property too. And that was a fun call. I returned the call and the woman who answered was the person who called's wife, and he wanted to disinter his mother and bury her in their backyard. And they were in the city of Rockford proper, but he had done all of the research and she had no idea that he was thinking about this and started yelling at me. And I was like, I'm just answering the question. Like, I didn't tell him to do it.
At least it wasn't her he was trying to bury.
Yeah, no, it was his mom, but I don't think she got along because there were a lot of cuss words. She was like, she's not coming here. So anyway, some of the other things with advanced planning, it really eliminates emotional overspending. I'm not saying that every funeral director is like a parasite that's going to get you in the door and try to upsell you, because I am not like that. But there are situations where, let's say your loved one's been in the hospital for 2 months, they go to a nursing home, they don't rebound, they don't get any better. And then you're tired, you're weary, you're trying to figure everything out, and then they pass away, and then you go to the funeral home, and it's just like you can't think anymore. So you're being guided by someone who might not have your best interests at heart. It also helps your family, I talked about this briefly, know what your exact wishes are versus like guessing. We talked about the products and services are guaranteed at the current cost. You can set aside funds for those things. Like I told you, the Register Star obituary is like $750 now. If you want to set aside additional money for like extraneous things that might go up in cost, you can do that. There's payment plans available if that's something that you need. And then you are the one that's in charge and have a say in your arrangements. Some people are totally fine with their children or their partner making those decisions. And maybe you're one of those people, but there are other people who have specific Bible verses they want read, or they want a poem, or they want this color casket, or they don't want to be cremated. And then it is transferable. We had talked about that. If you move away, you can take it with you to wherever you end up. We talked briefly about how the funds are placed and regulated by the comptroller. Big thing, we don't have access to those funds until its death occurs. You own it. You can designate a beneficiary if the prices, or if the policy earns so much interest that there's money left over when a death occurs. I have not witnessed this ever in like 20 years of like there being funds left over. But if there are, you can get those to whoever you designate as a beneficiary. If you ever need to qualify for Medicaid, one of the first things that social workers tell people to do is to pre-plan your funeral or cremation. It protects those assets. They're not viewed as an asset, so people can sock the money away that they've spent their whole life earning, know that their final expenses will be taken care of, and then they will be able to qualify for Medicaid if that's something that becomes necessary. And then we talked about if you move away from the area, it might be more expensive or less expensive. But again, if you relocate, it's a good idea to shop around for those services. And then this is something that when you're looking at your finances, it's okay to prepay or pick out everything in advance, but not actually prepay. If you elect to use life insurance at the time of death, most funeral homes use a third party to make sure like the benefits are in place. They verify who the beneficiaries are. I do, just because it's kind of arduous and time consuming to go back and forth with insurance companies. So there's usually a fee. So if you have a policy through your local insurance companies, let's say it's State Farm, and it's $100,000 and your funeral is $10,000, whomever your beneficiary is signs a form allowing the insurance company to pay us our expenses that you've contracted with us, and then the remaining money goes directly to the beneficiary. Again, talk about your wishes. I can't really highlight that enough. And also, if you've pre-planned, I mentioned it earlier, make sure people in your family, whoever's in charge, know where your paperwork is, what funeral home you're supposed to go to, so there's not those panicked calls. Future for me, the city allowed us through a change in our special use permit to put in a cemetery out back. I sit on about 7 acres, more or less, so I'm in the process of doing that now. We'll have an eco or green section available if that's something that is interesting to you. A pet cemetery, the human cemetery and pet cemetery. I have ideas. They haven't been designed yet, but I don't want them to be the rows of graves. I'm envisioning more of interactive spaces where people can come and meander, like back in the old days. People would come and have picnics. I want it to be something unique and different. I do still have people ask me this at every visitation that I've hosted here the last 5 or 6 years. If the bowling alley is still in the basement, it is. I finally found someone who can give it a once over, and it's pretty skunky and dank right now, but I still have the bar and the bowling alley in the basement that I want to utilize, not just for events, but I've had families that had a bowler and they're like, oh, can we have it downstairs? And it's gross right now. So these are kind of short-term upgrades that we have in mind here. So, and
Very
that's
cool.
it.
Well, we had a couple
Awesome.
questions come in here, Kristen, and hopefully you
Okay.
can answer these for us. So one person, obviously, many older people get replacement joints. So what happens to them if they're cremated?
Mhm.
That's a great question. And in the last year, I've had more people ask me if we remove them prior to cremation. And I'm like, "Ugh." So if you have joints and things like that, they stay inside the person. The cremation process takes place. And then we go through the cremated remains or ashes with a magnet. And then anything that isn't picked up, because I like titanium, I don't think gets picked up with a magnet. And that's what a lot of those are.
Mhm.
We kind of have to hand sort through there's bone fragments left, and then there's also like powdery ashes left. So prior to processing cremated remains, like we have to make sure there's no metal in it because it makes the processor blades very angry. And ask me how I know. They shriek and scream, and then I have to stop what I'm doing. So yeah, they stay. I've had people want to get joints back before. Like I had a lady who allegedly was going to make jewelry out of a titanium hip, and I don't think she had a flame that would melt it at all, but I just went along with it and smiled and nodded. Um, if people have fillings, like those stay, like dental work stays. I've occasionally had families want that removed to keep or melt or turn into something, jewelry, or I'm not judging. I shouldn't have a
Yeah.
judging face, but it did make me a little queasy. Um, we don't do that because it's beyond the scope of our licensure. So we can hire a dentist to come in and do that, but it's really cost prohibitive because what they charge is not worth the price of like the gold that someone has in their teeth fillings.
Mhm.
So
Interesting. And then one last question, and please, guys, if you have any other ones, we'll keep Kristen around for a little bit here. But tell me a reason why you would recommend a pre-need policy over a final expense policy, and maybe what the differences are of those.
So I am not super familiar with final expense policies other than like I've we've accepted them for payment, and
Mhm.
I think it's just like limited funds where once people hit a certain age, like you may have paid into a final expense policy, but then it doesn't even like pay out once you're beyond like a certain age range. And I think it's like 90. I'm not 100% sure.
It depends on the life insurance policy, but yeah, some of
Okay.
them have a maturity age of 90 if they've owned them for a long time and things like that.
Okay.
But
Can
yeah,
you speak more to final expense? Because it's something that I know
yeah,
of it, but I don't know a lot about it.
yeah. So typically a final expense policy, that's really just a name, and that it's, people buy it. It's a small whole life insurance policy, typically like a 10 or $15,000 policy that you would name the beneficiary on and all that kind of stuff. So it's just another type of life insurance policy. So
Okay.
honestly, I don't know that it's that different from what a pre-planned or pre-need policy that you're talking about. It's probably just the insurance company that you go through and things like that. Because a final expense policy will typically have questions that the person has to ask and things like that, which I would assume those are probably a little less expensive just because what you're using, Kristen, sounds more like almost a guaranteed issue because there's not a lot
Mhm.
of health questions that they ask or anything like that. Would that be fair to say?
That would be fair. And I would say really the main difference is that you need to, if you had a final expense policy, you need to make sure that it can keep up with inflationary price increases at the
Right.
funeral home. So we're guaranteeing products and services at the current cost, like a final expense policy, if it's $10,000 now and inflation is such that when you
Mhm.
die, it's, a $20,000 funeral, like there wouldn't be those funds available. So that's like
Right.
the biggest difference that I see with those.
It
Yeah.
also sounds like more like a final expense policy would be like the funds would be freed up to use for whatever purpose needed at the time, whereas a pre-need would be so maybe if you have the mindset of I don't really care what happens to me, let them decide, maybe final expense would be better. Whereas pre-need, if you know what you want and you want to prearrange that and cover that, it sounds like that would be more directly related to plans that you make in advance, if I'm
Yep.
correct on that.
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay.
Any more questions? I love questions, even the weird ones.
This is a good one. So, if you live in one state and want to be buried in another state, would you be cremated in the first state, or would the body have to be flown to the other state and it done there?
It depends on what type of arrangements you want to make. So we have done services where there's a person in a casket, visitation, funeral, and we either drive them to the other state or deceased people are sent on cargo for airlines. So there's people that have done traditional funeral here, and then we orchestrate flying them to Mexico, and they are buried. They'll have a whole other service there, and then they're buried in Mexico. Um, I would say like if your service is a direct cremation that you've prepaid and you are not in the state where it was arranged, it's more cost effective to go with cremating the person in Montana versus like flying a deceased person to Montana to be cremated. So, and then funeral directors are only licensed in individual states. So what we have a couple of Wisconsin licenses on staff. But if I were to go to Iowa and need to do a burial at a cemetery or even a church service, we have to pay a local funeral home to that area to cover our license. And basically it's like I'm doing the same work that I would do here in Illinois, but they sit there or they're in their car doing paperwork to make me legal in case like the Iowa professional regulations department shows up to make sure that I'm not operating illegally in another
Right.
state.
Awesome. Well, that's all we've got for questions. So thank you everybody for joining us. And obviously
Thank you.
a big thanks to Kristan for taking her time and walking through some of these things. These are questions that we get a lot, and obviously we don't deal with it all the time. So it's great to have a professional that's much more seasoned in this kind of stuff to answer these questions for us. So.
Yeah.
All right. And as I mentioned at the beginning, guys, this will be recorded. So we will be posting it up on our website and our YouTube channel and stuff like that. If you ever want to take a rewatch or send it to somebody that you know, that would be completely fine. But again, we do these Klaas University webinars on a pretty regular basis, and we try to cover all the different topics that kind of we don't specialize in, of course, but we want other, like I said, good professionals that know more about it to help our clients out. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.